Dear students, in this session we will be talking about Andre Bazin and his theory on the evolution of the language of cinema. But before everything, we would ask ourselves who was Andre Bazin? Why is he so important in the history of cinema? Andre Bazin is perhaps the greatest of the realist theoreticians in cinema. Basically a French man, died prematurely in 1958 at a tender age of 40 because of tubercular infection. Within this short span, he created a body of writing which practically organized the canon of realism in cinema. And beyond that, he also created a group of disciples who mainly worked in his magazine, Le Cahiers du Cinéma. Among them, the most important are Jean-Luc Godard and François Truffaut. Yes, he is practically the principal inspiration between and after the formation of the film movement called La Nouvelle Vague, the Nouvelle Vague. Now about his theory. What did he mean by the evolution of film language? Actually, he was referring to a period when silent cinema could generate a formal success of its own. It was around 1928. In 1926, because through the jazz singer, Hollywood could invent sound, but still people believed in the possibilities of silent cinema, and they were in the habit of dividing cinema into two periods, silent and sound. One period consisted of images which had no sound support, that was dialogue support, and the other period which would generate and will find dialogue support. But Bazin refused to buy this argument. He said this is a kind of artificial division. Depending on the technicalities employed in taking photographic images, in editing them, the actual difference lies in the fact that in the history of cinema we find two groups of directors in every phase. The first group depend on the resources of montage, and the second group depends on reality. What did he mean by the resources of montage and the resources of reality? Actually, when he said the resources of montage, he included the plastics, the set, the elements of mise-en-scène, how the director has used space and other things like light, like camera angles, etc. How he created the meaning of a particular situation, of a particular sequence. We can consider the case of, say, Battleship Potemkin or any other Hollywood cinema of that period, say Intolerance by D.W. Griffith. And what happens with the people who believe in the real? They usually depend on the possibility of the image itself. They believe in a kind of situation when the image would speak for itself and will not take help from a kind of editing. By that, he specifically referred to two groups of filmmakers, say people who believe in the possibility of editing. Hollywood believed in a kind of invisible editing, and the Russians, the Soviet filmmakers, believed in a kind of montage theory. Basically, when you talk of invisible editing in Hollywood, smooth, seamless things, you state that reality can be organized by editing the real components. Hollywood did havoc with them. They are real masters of the situation. And what did Eisenstein and his colleagues do? You refer to montage of attractions, you refer to intellectual montage and everything. According to Bazin, you see that you have seen things which are being constructed. The meanings were pre-formulated and the meanings are just conveyed to you. You are not there to create the meanings. The meanings are already formulated. The arrangements are different. Whenever a train moves in Abalgance, whenever a sword fighting takes place in any American cinema, whenever the battle Odessa step sequence in Battleship Potemkin takes place, it is actually an arrangement of images using temporal parameters, but not a journey into the real. It's perhaps one of the most controversial points of Bazin. What he is up to? He is not believing Eisenstein and Griffith. No, he has strong faith for them. But what he is saying, that people like Robert Flaherty, F.W. Murnau and Erich Stroheim did just the opposite thing. He gave a specific instance from Robert Flaherty, the case of seal hunting in Nanook of the North. What was the case with Flaherty? He refused to cut it. He set his camera, scrutinizing the entire event. Actually, what you will see that in that specific sequence, the real time nearly equaled the real time. The real time actually falls in tune with the cinematic time. Such a case also took place in Satyajit Ray's Charulata, made in 1964. It's a kind of influence that Bazin's theory could exert on the filmmakers worldwide. You get less cuts, therefore less interference with reality, and therefore these long takes will help you out in achieving the essence of the real.
Broju? ব্রজু ব্রজু
আজকে যাই মা
কানে শুনতে পাও না নাকি 4টে বেজে গেছে অফিসে চা দিয়ে এসো
Thus, Baja created two groups of filmmakers, one who places their faith in the real, people like Flaherty, Murnau, Stroheim, and the other groups, the famous Hollywood filmmakers, the Soviet filmmakers. They actually uses the resources of montage to drive their point home. As far as Banja is concerned, he would say that in montage cinema you would find a guided journey, while in other cinemas it's a journey which belongs specifically to your mood. You can get yourself more involved in it. So, according to Baja, the principles of representation remain the same, notwithstanding the presence of sound and dialogue in the cinematic experience. How was cinema around 1938? Baja asked us specifically, and he gave his own answer, that you look at any cinema and you would see the editing principle basically this. Say, food and a hungry tramp sequence. What do you get? You get a full shot comprising the tramp and the food. Then you get a close-up of the tramp. Then you get a full shot of the food. Then you see the tramp approaching the table. And to conclude, you find the tramp having a chicken wing, pleased. This was the general principle. You can, of course, make different shots, but this was the general principle. Why he called it general principle? Because the ultimate purpose of the sequence remained in creating the verisimilitude of space. Verisimilitude means a kind of likeness, a kind of resemblance of the space. And then, what is the effect of cutting? Regardless of the fact that what kind of meaning you are interested to generate, the cutting principle should be located in either dramatic effect or in creating psychological effect. This was like a general formula for cinema construction. And Baja was opposed to it. He said that it creates a meaning, definitely, but it creates a predetermined meaning. The viewer becomes helpless. He believes in things what he is forced to believe by the director. He has no autonomy, he has no freedom. So he looked at other directors, people like Jean Renoir in his home country, in France, and people like Orson Welles in USA, who made Citizen Kane. What made all the differences? If you speak about Renoir, and if you speak about Griffith, Orson Welles, and if you speak about any Hollywood director like John Ford, what is the ultimate difference? The difference is that people like John Ford, despite brilliant photographies, despite brilliant storytelling techniques, depend on a principle which places heaviest emphasis on editing, on montage. And what does Orson Welles do? What does Jean Renoir do? They actually look at you quite patiently, allows the camera to probe deeply without cutting, and they create a kind of autonomy for the space to generate meanings which were not really there in montage photographies. Baja was actually making his arguments for deep focus photography. Before all that, for you students, I must, in simple sentences, explain what deep focus photography is. Deep focus photography is a kind of photography where illumination in your front, illumination in your back, and in the location where you are standing remains the same, light with same intensity. What will be created? The image will be information dense. You will be meaningful. You will have more meaning in association with the objects that surround you. How does that help in creating meaning in cinema? Because several information poured in, so you can place an individual within the general location of history. This is the case of Citizen Kane, and this is the case with La Règle du Jeu, Rules of the Game. These two great films, André Bazin admired so much. He said, therefore, that deep focus photography is not just a stock of the trade in cinema making. It's a revolutionary step forward in the history of montage. To quote him, it is a dialectical step forward in the history of montage. Why did he say it so? Because if we follow his arguments, the deep focus photography gives a spectator more time to come closer to images. And if we follow his argument, logically speaking, the spectator finds more time in decoding the meaning of the images. If we go further, then historically speaking, he becomes more active. In the cinema of montages, he remained passive. He is a receiver of the narrative. The meanings are supplied to them, while in deep focus, he becomes active. He becomes inquisitive. What is going to happen? Let's try to analyze. And then, the verisimilitude of space becomes so important that it makes you a conscious activist of the situation. In other words, if we continue our discussion on André Bazin, we would find that the process can be analyzed as the montage cinema depends more on human psychology, whereas the deep focus cinema or the cinemas which use less number of cuttings, they depend more on metaphysics. They are more philosophical. How do we explain that? In montage cinemas, in the conventional cinemas, the meanings are formed and they are supplied in a sequential order. Of course, you can have a different kind of editing technique, but then the cinema will be different. But in these kind of cinemas, in cinemas of Jean Renoir, Orson Welles, Flaherty, Murnau, Stroheim, what happens? Actually, you would find there is a kind of ambiguity. It can create more meanings, or it can create, truthfully speaking, it can create meanings in order to have a proper analysis of a situation. You require meanings rather than a meaning. This particular statement on my part, I am sure, requires a kind of explanation. Actually, when Bazin wrote this essay, he was in post-war France, ideologies were shattered, and Europe had to experience perhaps the greatest disaster in civilization, the war. The war saw on the European soil devastation of two opposing ideologies, communism and fascism. Now, men were doomed to be free. Sartre asserted in his play, The Flies, I am my own freedom. And since Bazin was an existentialist in nature, he was a follower of Sartre, he said that even in cinema, man should be given to choices. He should not be driven to find a goal. Rather, he should be located in a ground where he can find different goalposts, different objectives. He can decide his own fate. It's a matter of choice, and choice being a strong existentialist option for human existence. Bazin's explanation of cinema, I say, has a strong existential connotation with the tune of the age. He preferred ambiguities. He wanted to state that historically speaking, a spectator is equally important to that extent when the task of meaning formation is concerned. He becomes a historically active subject rather than remaining a passive subject. Bazin's criticism can be treated as a piece of engaged criticism, engagement, with the French connotation of the term. In English, it can be said parallel of commitment. But I am afraid to say that commitment and engagement are not the same thing. Engagement has a historical link, which commitment lacks. In any case, we can say committed criticism or engaged criticism. And if we look at it, that how Bazin explains all these things, look at the particular case of neorealism, which was being highlighted by André Bazin. He thought it's a liberating moment of cinema because all the filmmakers of neorealism who found their way after the war from 1945, Luciano Visconti, Roberto Rossellini, Vittorio De Sica, all these filmmakers, instead of trying to negotiate with the fragmented time order, depended on the ontological wholeness of reality by making the space practically autonomous. Look at the criticism that Bazin wrote in defense of Ladri di Bicyclette, bicycle thieves. What did he say? He said, since the director depended heavily on deep focus, Antonio Ricci, the protagonist, was given much space to move about. And his son Bruno, the equal space. And there was lesser number of cards. We find time to ask ourselves, who are these people? Are they real working class protagonists, or they represent something more? And in the end, we ourselves discover that it is God and His Son moving through the streets of Rome in a deplorable situation. So what else man can do? These are questions that are automatically raised in cinema. And that is why Bazin could argue in the evolution of the language of cinema that is not neorealism primarily a matter of humanism and only secondarily a matter of film style. Though he preferred a kind of film style, it ultimately became a matter of humanism.
C'avevo una bicicletta sola,
Lascia stare, lascialo perdere. E mo me la ciò qui. Non voglio impicci, lascialo stare. Buongiorno a tutti e grazie. Bella roba che insegna al tuo figlio. Manca la vergogna.
Sei fortunato che hai trovato quello lì, ma se era per me te ci portavo dentro.
Vattene a casa che ti ha detto bene. Va, tira, tira. È meglio che te ne vai, va.
The same thing happened in Charulata with all the Satyajit Ray cinemas practically in between 1955 and 1964. If you look at him, if you look at Charulata, the woman moving inside the interiors of a 19th century mansion, what do you find? How do you decode her existence? It is because of the unparalleled deep focus photography that Satyajit Ray used. It is because of the fact that Satyajit avoided cutting a movement. He took a voyeuristic position as much as you can. As much you can maintain the input received from the viewing end. He believed in such a style, and therefore we can discover so much meaning in Charulata, a kind of different meaning that Rabindranath originally inserted in his original text written as Nostonir in 1902. Dear students, you must have appreciated by this time that why Baja took up the cause of evolution as far as the history of cinema is concerned. He was not that particular with the details of technical changeovers. He was more interested in having a philosophical moment. For him, the cinema language was a kind of existential choice. How cinema can speak for itself, how cinema meanings can find an autonomy. That was Baja's fundamental position. And that is why he can be called a great thinker, because he wanted to find cinema making as a kind of historical praxis, and he wanted to see the observers as human subjects striving to become active and transient, no longer a passive and mute spectator of history. Thank you.